This is the best of First and Last, the podcast, with Mike Golic Jr. and Robin Lundberg.
North Carolina has won their sixth national championship, as you heard, which, by the way, it just struck me hearing that, Mike. Roy Williams has 3 national championships. North Carolina has 6. So he's doing pretty good considering the history of that program.
Yeah, considering the coach he took over there for in Dean Smith and what he's been able to do now, cementing his legacy with another championship, adding to an already incredible body of work. It's a good morning to be a Tar Heel right now. Go Tar Heels, go America.
Are the Tar Heels synonymous with America?
That's a familiar rallying cry for at least some of the Tar Heel fans that I've become accustomed to. So I felt I'd give them the nod right now for the culture.
I could see it. Carolina blue. I mean, Carolina blue might be objectively the best color. It's right up there.
Oh, I think their jerseys are among the most elite in college sports. Maybe in any sports, you throw the Argyle in there, and it has all the makings of a team that just went out there and won you a national championship.
Of course, Roy Williams famously at Kansas before North Carolina, but getting there 2003. And since he's been there in 2003, the best record of any coach in the NCAA tournament. So something to be said for what he's done with that team. And on the other side of the equation, Gonzaga falling, and I feel kind of bad for them because it goes right into their reputation. And Mark Few getting perilously close to the worst record of any coach ever against number 1 seeds in the NCAA tournament.
It doesn't help the argument of people who called their cupcake run through the tournament just that, a cupcake schedule. Really took them to task for their regular season, the conference that they play in. But really, I think what you saw last night was, first and foremost, in general, a very ugly basketball game for a lot of reasons that we'll get to, but one that was at the very least super competitive. We saw a ton of lead changes there. We saw both of these teams responding well to the ebbs and flows of the game, and ultimately it came down to North Carolina being able to make the plays at the end where, Nigel Williams-Goss, the ankle injury, coming up short on a shot that probably would have equalized or helped get them back into it, and just able to make one more play than Gonzaga was North Carolina.
And you get to hear both sounds of that. One is you want the thrill of victory or the agony of defeat first?
Let's go thrill of victory first.
Thrill of victory, Roy Williams, after his team's win.
They're all extremely special. I've been very, very lucky, but I'd say this one is probably more special because it's been a journey for the last 3 or 4 years of trying to do something. The tough thing is it doesn't make Marcus, Bryce, and Joel feel any better. So that's the thing that I'm going to have for a long time. As I said yesterday or whenever it was, the feeling of inadequacy in the locker room last year is the worst feeling I've ever had.
It didn't sound like really, the thrill of victory to me.
No, well, it is that remembrance of last year, and that was what I was really captivated by as I sat and watched the end of that game last night, that realization that this was a team, we applauded a lot of their guys, maybe not applauded, but just pointed out the fact that you had a very senior-laden roster full of upperclassmen guys who had been around, and a large core of the team that was there last year. You heard Roy Williams mention the guys that were a part of last year's loss that weren't here for this season, but the fact that they were able to do what's so unique in sports, take all of that hunger, take all of that pain from last year, from losing on a dramatic last-second shot, one of the best we've seen in a long time in college basketball, and put their money where their mouth is, probably going into that offseason saying, we're not going to let this happen to us again. And sure as hell, for a team that wasn't a number 1 ranked team throughout the season, got into the tournament and said, we are not going to be denied if we get that opportunity again, and they did just that.
On the other side, the true agony of defeat from Mark Few.
It was a great shared experience. I'm hoping, praying that this perspective will come quicker. What's really tough right now is talking to Coach Boeheim earlier in the week. He told me it'll crush you if you don't win it. And I guess I didn't understand it, but the cagey old veteran's right, man. It crushes you.
And we'll make that Straight Talk brought to you by Straight Talk Wireless, best phones, best networks, half the cost. Gonzaga not crushed in the game, but crushed in spirit, falling to North Carolina 71-65 last night in the national championship game. Straight Talk Wireless, nationwide coverage on America's largest and most dependable networks. Few things to get to within the game. First of all, the game itself and how these two teams matched up. To me, there was no real discernible difference in quality between the two teams. I would say Gonzaga had the edge with size and shooting, and North Carolina had the edge with athleticism and length. And generally, length is a big-time equalizer in basketball. It's tough to get past. And the very start of the second half, to me, was the difference in that game as far as who came out on top, because right away, North Carolina erased it was just a 3-point lead at half, but took control of that game and seemed to do so because they were suffocating Gonzaga and what they were trying to do in those first few minutes.
We saw a lot more of what we talked about as the strength for North Carolina, their ability to get on the glass and make hay, to get second chance opportunities, to keep that ball in play for them and give their long, able athletes that chance to go up there and get it, and give credit to guys all across the board, Justin Jackson, Isaiah Hicks, all of these big, long players that we've come to know for this team that were absolute game breakers at certain times.
On the other side of things for Gonzaga, who actually out-rebounded North Carolina in the game, Karnowski was terrible. I don't know what was going on specifically with him, but he was basically a self-check. He was terrible on offense and on defense, and that really, really hurt them.
Well, it was just a lack of ability to finish, because there were plenty of moments where he got down on the block and was able to get deep in the post, was able to use all that size to get right up next to the basket, and for whatever reason just did not have the touch last night. A lot of point-blank shots that just wound up being misses and big misses that gave North Carolina a chance to get it running towards the other end. It was tough to watch for a guy that had become such a story throughout this tournament, and like I said, gave himself plenty of good chances and good looks at it and just couldn't put many of them home.
Ugly-looking shots from him in that game. And that's the other story that I think is going to be focused on a lot today. And I hate to be that guy because I don't want to be like – I'm not on some like anti-college basketball quest. And there have been plenty of enjoyable moments in this tournament. And it's been very well received and very well rated. So objectively speaking, people have really liked the NCAA tournament. To me, that second half was – not the first half. The second half was a chore to watch at times, because not just really the gameplay, but more the officiating and the lack of rhythm that goes on there. The refs have been a subplot of this entire tournament, and they really were on display in that second half last night.
It's always interesting. So it can go two ways. It can be extremes both ways, where certainly at times we saw earlier in the tournament where certain officials were getting death threats and all these dumb things that dumb people tend to do as an emotional response to something they see. But on the other side, we'll go out of our way to excuse what we see out of the referees sometimes, basically saying their job is difficult, this, that, and the other. I think Bill Walton, I heard on our pregame yesterday, basically say, we're going to hold 18 and 19-year-old kids to a high standard on and off the court, but we're not going to ask the same of the grown men outside, the only other grown men on the court outside of the coaches in the game that are the referees, and hold them to that said same standard. It seems wildly hypocritical, and it's something that we talk about with a lot of the other leagues, the health and viability of certain leagues and what they can do to improve their product. If I'm college basketball, that's something I'm taking a serious look at, is just how the officiating is enforced, especially when you get to these big moments, because that's where the product is most widely consumed, is when we got to March, and that's the last thing you want, is us coming on, like a lot of people will this morning, saying the refs were a storyline this year.
Well, there are 44 personal foul calls. I'll give some ideas a little bit later in the show about how to improve the aesthetics of the overall product, but that's definitely one of them. 44 total calls. And by the way, you can't have kids foul out with 5 fouls if the refs are going to be blowing the whistle the way they were. You know, then you have Collins going to the bench for Gonzaga and various people in foul trouble. If they're going to be blowing the whistle at that sort of rate, then you have to give the kids in the game more fouls before they're disqualified.
I mean, I felt like the mascot for North Carolina was playing for 4 fouls with most of that game. It seemed like everyone looking up and down that list was playing right on the edge, and that's the last thing you want. You don't want to remove the star players, especially from the court, and that's the kind of position you put yourself in with this combination of circumstances.
First and last, the the podcast.
How about one shining moment as a point of celebration? I sat around. They really delayed putting one shining moment on TV. They were trying to drag this out and make sure they got a few more ads in before they put that up there. But it's one thing, it's so easy, I think, in this day and age to be cynical about a lot of stuff. One shining moment defied that for me. I sat there and I was ready to find something in there that was worthy of firing off a snarky tweet, and instead I just sat there and I got chills.
You know what? I would have liked to see it, but my one shining moment was trying to grab a nap before the show, starting early. And with that game, maybe we can get to this a little bit later. I don't know. Is it old man yells at cloud to say that game started too late? I feel for the West Coast, I guess. And I've loved it when I've been on the West Coast. When you're on the West Coast, it's glorious because you'll be sitting there and you're. Last time I was out there, I was in a hotel and I was gathering myself to leave my hotel room around 6 p.m. And I turn on the TV and I'm like, oh, this is the stuff I watch at night when I'm at home. It's on TV. It's so glorious. So it'd be tough, I guess, to have a game at 5 o'clock in the afternoon or in the early evening. But I suppose our shift really skews it for me, 9:20 p.m. just seems like a late tip.
I think it seems like a late tip for a lot of people, and this is true of a lot of sporting events on the East Coast. It always runs into that similar issue. So maybe a lot of people did. I saw on the show note, James said that some local stations in certain places cut the local programming before one shining moment got there. So there were some people that were deprived. Now, thankfully, we live in a day and age where that's probably going to hit Twitter or the internet, and you'll be able to catch up there. But that's still one of those instances where I like being gathered around the TV there. You love the immediacy of what they're able to put together. You get the clips from the championship game. They do a great job of building back in some of the stories that we had already forgotten from earlier on in the tournament, and then just jam-pack it with emotion. All of the emotion coming off the tournament. We've got more sound from Nigel Williams, Gaze, and all these guys that just in those moments you find out how much it means because you can hear them breaking. You can hear them understanding their basketball mortality, at least at the college level, and it stings and it hurts to hear, let alone live through.
Well, let's hear from Nigel Williams, Goss, who did lose that game last night, as well as his Gonzaga Bulldogs.
Nigel, you guys had so many chances to take the lead, potentially win this game. How do you rationalize the way it ended?
Yeah, it's tough. It's tough when you feel like you had plenty of chances, plenty of opportunities to make plays, to win a game. It's just kind of like one of those once-in-a-lifetime opportunities, and it hurts because, you might not get this opportunity again. So you got to give Carolina a lot of credit. They played hard. They played tough. Both teams battled, but it does sting when you didn't capitalize on those opportunities.
You say it hurt. You've obviously been tearing up a little. How do you describe the pain that you're feeling right now?
It's tough. It's tough when you feel like if you're at your best tonight that you win the game, and I wasn't at my best tonight. And, I think same goes for, a lot of other players on this team. None of us feel like we played our best, and that's tough to swallow. But, we can hang our hats on the fact that we know we put in the work, and tonight just wasn't our night, which is tough.
You hurt your ankle right toward the end. There's a timeout. And then you came back in. Your shot was a little bit short. How much did it affect you?
Yeah, I sprayed it pretty good, and I'm not going to lie, it did hurt, but I missed some easy shots all game. Credit, to Carolina, they did make some good defensive plays at times, and then there were times where I just missed some shots that I normally make. So, it only happened the last, minute, and I was able to get through it, and it just hurts.
You got this program to the national championship game within a couple possessions of winning it. What have you and these players, do you think, meant to Gonzaga and the Spokane community?
I think we've meant a lot, and I just think just seeing all the smiles on people's faces that we've put on them, I feel like we made our city proud, we made our school proud, but it just hurts that we weren't able to finish the deal. But I'm glad I was able to be part of the first team in history to get us to the Final Four, and it just leaves the door open for the next group of Zags to come in here and close the deal.
Well, congratulations on a great season.
Thank you so much.
You can hear the pain as communicated to Andy Katz, ESPN Radio, presented by Progressive Insurance. Now you can test drive Snapshot to see how much you could save before switching to Progressive. Visit progressive.com/snapshot. Refs, sometimes you're told to swallow the whistle. I just successfully swallowed a sneeze during that billboard there I was reading. Usually sneezes, there's no going back once they begin, but I was able to hold that one in.
And we just, heard Nigel talk about overcoming a lot and lifting this Gonzaga program. I'm proud of you for overcoming in that moment and lifting up this first and last program and trying to make it as best as you possibly can.
I referenced the statistic before the break about the number of calls, foul calls in that game, 44. There were 46 field goals in the game. So that's a little bit of the context. 46 total field goals and 44 total foul calls. That's too close.
As I say, you'd hate to see that number there. 52 free throw attempts in the game. I think the record was 61 or just about in that area. So it's all just weight. It makes the game choppy. It makes it harder to consume. And that's not what you want when you're built around the ultimate, product that you're putting out in the tournament, the very last game that everyone's pointed to. And I think when both the Final Four games were very compelling, we saw a Gonzaga team that was great defensively, that we talked about going up against an equally powerful South Carolina defense, and that game was up and down, it was moving, it felt fast-paced, and this one just felt like you were trekking through mud for a while.
There was a foul called on average every 54 seconds of the game clock. So basketball, to me is a beautiful game, and some people would say soccer and hockey would be their choices. But in a lot of ways, they're all similar because they're free-flowing. You want to see it go back and forth, attempts on goal or attempts on net, and just constant action. That's when it's at its best. Like when you're captivated. Oh, man, three-pointer on this side, dunk on this side, steal, we're going back the other way. Like all that stuff. 54 seconds on average, you're not getting any of that barely. Because that, choppy's the best possible word I think you could use as to describe that.
It is, and I also don't want to let the on-the-court action itself skate completely because, yes, the refs played a role in that, but also the other part of it is shot selection on the part of both these teams, and that's something that I think reminds you of the difference between the college and the NBA level is you see a lot of kids taking really bad shots at certain points in this game, and sometimes it came on the heels of tempo where it looked like there was a back and forth and there were things going, but more often than not, it was kids settling for really bad jump shot looks early in the shot clock that just gave the other team a fast break opportunity coming off of it. So there were multiple things at play that all led to it being what felt like a bit of a slog for a while.
Again, bonus first and last tonight as North Carolina beats Gonzaga 71-65 to win the national championship. You see that score. It was definitely a close game, and anytime it's close, it's a little bit more compelling down the stretch. I wouldn't say it was a good game, though. Was it a close game or a good game? 888-729-3776, 888-SAY-ESPN. Your call's coming up in just a matter of moments. Are you willing to take the other side? Are you willing to say it was a good game?
No, I'm not. It was a close game.
Oh man,
and that makes it compelling. I'm sorry. I'd like to. I really would because it was compelling.
You're a sportsman guy. Like you really can look at it that way generally. So if you're saying that, I know it was an ugly game.
You just couldn't help it. And I was in the best possible setting. I was in a sports bar. I was sitting there watching and enjoying a cold one. Look up there. You had all of the elements that would make for a great way to consume the national championship. And instead you end up sitting there discussing during a lot of these free throw attempts that, man, it seems like we're really having to, drag ourselves kicking and screaming to the finish line.
You get a lot of discussions done because there's all that dead space. It's like, hey, you again. What do you think of that call?
First and last.
Roy Williams celebrating as he's won another national championship, his third. To put it in perspective, only Adolph Rupp, Mike Krzyzewski, and John Wooden have won more. And when you look at programs, Mike, UCLA has the most, but that is from mostly way back. Their last championship was in 1995, 11 championships. Then it's Kentucky at 8, North Carolina at 6, and Duke at 5, tied with Indiana. But Indiana's last title was in 1987. So those middle teams, UCLA is still a good program, but they're not what they were in their heyday. Those are the three, if you were to tell me, if we were on Family Feud, what are the best programs in college basketball, those are the first three answers that would pop into my head. Kentucky, North Carolina, and Duke.
And it would make perfect sense if you were looking at North Carolina, so they've now won championships in 1995. The most recent ones, I should say, going back to 1995 and then, 2005, 2009, and this year. the last 3 of those belonging to Roy Williams. It's been an impressive run, and even in the years they haven't won, I mean, we know last year they famously lost on that last-second shot, or else this could have even been another one added to the trophy case for them. It's been a really, really impressive run by Roy Williams and this Tar Heel outfit.
An ugly game, but a close game last night. Your thoughts, 888-729-3776. How about Colton in Phoenix? Colton, you're up first here on First and Last. Go ahead.
All right, man. So I had 2 thoughts. One thought was that this was a close game. I didn't think it was a good game, not even in the slightest. I think North Carolina probably had one of their worst games in the whole season. But I think Roy Williams just kind of coached them up and got them to the win. But also, I think that if North Carolina played the game that Gonzaga had played and how well Gonzaga was playing, I think that North Carolina would have just kind of blow those guys out. And also, I think the players in Gonzaga aren't as well prepared as the guys in North Carolina. I think those guys in North Carolina were really just ready for that test and ready to go. And I don't think Karnowski and I don't think Collins are ready for that. I don't think they're ready for the pressure.
But you said Gonzaga played well. I wouldn't say that at all. I mean, Nigel Williams was 5 of 17 from the floor. Karnowski was 1 of 8 from the floor. Matthews was 2 of 7 from the floor. That's 3 of their starting 5. I mean, they shot 34% from the floor overall. North Carolina wasn't much better, just at 35.6%, which speaks to the overall quality of the game. You know, here's a stat that generally would not happen. This one is against the grain. Gonzaga shot 42% from 3. North Carolina shot 15% from 3 and won the game.
It's remarkable, and it wasn't even like Gonzaga shot 42% on a smaller number. They were 8 of 19 to North Carolina. Now, North Carolina ended up shooting 8 more. They were 4 of 27, but it wasn't like the volume was that grossly disparate there. And you're right, North Carolina still managing to find an edge aside from being anemic at the three-point line.
Justin Jackson hurt that North Carolina total. He was 0 of 9 from 3 in that game. He still managed to get 16 points, but on 19 shots. Just that kind of grind of a game. It really was. The first half to me was it's odd because the first half was pretty smooth, but North Carolina I did not think played well in the first half. Right off the bat in the second half, I thought North Carolina asserted themselves, but then the game was never allowed to be given a rhythm because of all the whistles that took place until you get to the very end. Once you fast forward to the very end, of course, you're going to be like, all right, this game's close, so it's going to be compelling at this moment. But just a lot of a very staccato sort of performance.
It is, and we talked about it before that the kids in this game deserve their share of the blame for some poor shot selection. You get to numbers like we just read for North Carolina from the three-point line because of things like that, taking bad early shots in transition early in the shot clock that lead to chances for fast break points the other way for Gonzaga, but also give these kids credit for being able to overcome that in the second half. It's a difficult thing when the game flow is taken out of your hands to an extent the way it was by officials, and so being able to overcome, to find a way to keep it close on both sides and to have as many lead changes and back and forth as we did.
How about Brandon in Missouri? Brandon, you're up next here on First and Last. Go ahead.
Thank you for your time, guys. I can't disagree more with that last caller, man. I don't know what he's talking about. What is he saying? Carolina's going to blow them out. Are you serious? Did you see the shot selection that Jackson was making, those threes that he was just throwing up there early in the shot clock? Kaminsky missed how many buckets right there at the rim? I'll tell you right now, if Gonzaga would have just made better shots, or if they would have made the shots right there at the rim, or any other shots at the rim like Doss, I don't know how many layups, floaters they missed right there in the paint. Man, there is no question that Gonzaga should have won that game. You just said that stat right now. Was it 43% for 3 points with Gonzaga and 15 for North Carolina? I mean, Carolina got lucky. That's all I got to say. Appreciate your time, boys. Thank you.
it's hard to say it comes down to luck at all. North Carolina was able to make big plays when it mattered the most. Where I will agree is that it's not like this Gonzaga team was overmatched. It's not like they were out there looking like they were scared. They had some of their big players come up short in that moment. Karnowski was the one he brought up there, mistaking him for another large Caucasian center, and Frank Kaminsky from the Wisconsin team of yesteryear.
They don't really look alike, but okay.
Well, it's without the beard. Frank Kaminsky wishes he had the kind of beard that Karnowski was sporting, and that had become iconic for him over the tournament. But
Karnowski looks like he fights bears.
Yes, well, I mean, between really him last night and Kennedy Meeks going down on the floor for loose balls looked like a couple of bears going at it. They're two very big, hulking figures in the middle that meant a lot for their teams, but Karnowski's a guy who had given them a level of production and instead went 1 for 8 last night from the field, getting most of his points at the line, so still able to draw some fouls, the many that we saw during the game, but just wasn't nearly as effective from close range as we're used to seeing from him in this tournament.
You look at the box score and you try to see why North Carolina won the game. They shot slightly better from the field, but it wasn't a big difference. They shot way worse from 3. They shot significantly worse from the free throw line. They were out-rebounded. The difference, if you're just looking for one statistic, is turnovers. 10 more turnovers for Gonzaga. And I referenced the start of the second half. To me, that was the big swing in the game because Gonzaga looked like they were in control for most of that first half. Perhaps they could have had a bigger lead. They were only up 3 going into the half, but when North Carolina immediately seized the lead and flipped that advantage, I thought was the difference. And that was the result of, it was 2 turnovers right off the bat from the guards of Gonzaga and a 3 eventually for North Carolina. So that swing, that first couple of minutes of the second half, I think is what won it for the Tar Heels.
And you mentioned the length of North Carolina early in the show. That shows up in a lot of those moments on defense where Gonzaga had really given a lot of people issues being able to throw the ball down to someone like Karnowski on the block and then work the ball back outside, get defenses overextended. North Carolina had the length and athleticism to close back out, to make those passing lanes a little bit tighter, and to give those guys all a ton of trouble just trying to move the ball around on offense the way they had so easily for most of the tournament.
And when you're seeing and you're playing basketball, you can't prepare for that sort of length because what happens is you see the spots that you're typically putting the ball in. And you're just preparing, you're remembering, and you make that pass all the time, or you make that shot all that time, that little baby hook. But when that length is there, especially when it's combined with that athleticism, you're going through the typical motions, and then all of a sudden a finger gets on the ball, or the hand slaps the ball the other way, and they're off and running. And no matter how many times it happens to you in a game, it still takes a long time to adjust to it because you're not facing that in all the other games leading up until that moment.
Well, it's what we always say about quarterbacks that are making the jump to the next level, going from college to the NFL, is all those windows you're used to putting the ball into close in a hurry, and that's exactly what you pointed out there with Gonzaga and what they felt last night against North Carolina, and a team that was just longer, stronger, and ultimately able to get more done on the defensive end because of it.
I mean, 2 closely matched teams, obviously, when you have a score like that. But North Carolina, I think that was the difference. Because if I'm sizing these 2 teams up, I said Gonzaga has the size, they have the shooting. But North Carolina has the length, and they have the athleticism. 888-729-3776, at Robin Ludberg, at M. Golic Jr. 57 on the 1-800-Flowers.com Twitter feed. Another thing North Carolina has, that's Roy Williams. We get into his legacy. And really, is there any conversation he shouldn't be a part of now when you're talking about best college coaches?
Seems like one he should. I have a feeling we'll get more into that next.
First and last.
It's going to go down as how many titles you win. People will try to say, well, he just rolls the ball out there. People will try to say, well, he's had Carolina and Kansas, 2 of the elite, probably 3 jobs in America. Does it matter at the end of the day? No. I mean, the guy wins titles, and he's a Hall of Famer who has won 3 titles. I don't know if he'll win another. I don't think it matters because the bottom line is there's some people who think Roy Williams is vastly overrated in the industry, and there's other people who think he's vastly underrated. So he's one of those guys that's almost a lightning rod, and now with all the NCAA investigation and the academic scandal, he's become even more of a lightning rod than just his coaching acumen it's now his character that's been questioned.
That was Jeff Goodman, college basketball analyst here on ESPN Radio. The part that stood out to me, Mike, is the reference that some people think Roy Williams is vastly overrated. Separating the academic scandal, which I'm sure we could get to coming up, but just as far as on-court performance, how? Like, I don't understand what your logic would be in making that case. Simply, I could counter any case anyone would make by saying, North Carolina, I'm reading straight off the packet of information we're sent, but this says it all. North Carolina has been the best team in the country as far as the NCAA tournament goes since Roy Williams became head coach in 2003, 2004. And then there's some ranks. North Carolina under Roy Williams since 2003, 2004. NCAA tournament wins, 42. That ranks first. Final Fours, 5. That ranks first. National titles, 3. That ranks first. So, like, what are you saying?
Yeah, how far down the list do you need to go? And the one thing I do understand is, you heard Jeff say it in there, you're going to be judged as a coach by how many championships you're ultimately going to be able to win. And I think when you start getting up to numbers this high, when you get in, he mentioned there's only 6 coaches that have won 3 or more championships at the NCAA level in the men's side for basketball. And over that amount of time, when you have that many plot points, it starts to become a pattern. But in general, we talk about all the time what a bad model the tournament is for picking a true champion. And so to judge it solely off that, in a lot of instances, would be misguided. But you look at all the other things. He's been to 9 Final Fours in his time there. He has won 8 ACC regular season championships in that conference. One of them we talk about as maybe the toughest conference in college basketball almost every year. It just gets harder and harder to try and find holes in this resume other than penalizing him for being able to land 2 of the most coveted head coaching jobs in all of America and getting to coach great kids, which we talk about all the time on this show. Great coaches and great players all usually tend to go hand in hand. One doesn't exist without the other in most cases.
The academic part of it, if we were to delve into it, I mean, it's like a separate subcategory, but I don't know how much people are bothered by that. Personally, it's difficult for me to be bothered by the academic scandal simply because of that requires a longer look at the entire sort of fraudulent premise of amateur athletics when it comes to this stage. That's the other side of the players aren't paid coin, right? If they're not paid, okay, you're this big giant business. That's why you're bringing these players in for the most part when it comes to these college basketball and football programs, because it's making money. It's generating these massive things like the college football playoff and the NCAA tournament. It's not really for the academic aspect of it. Then, if you're saying that, if we're assuming that's true, the whole other side of it is not really that important because that's not what they're there for. I understand, like, on the surface, you don't want people cheating or you don't want people just cruising through college, or if you're looking at it from a very pure standpoint, then they're not getting out what they're in there for. But a lot of the times, that's not really what they're in there for.
Yeah, there's 2 different ways to look at it. You can look at it for what we think it should be and what it probably should start to look like, and that's all the things that you just talked about. And the other way to look at it is, well, all right, you still have a system and a way of doing things right now that exists in place that Roy Williams in North Carolina knows, and one that now, in addition to all the exploitation that we talk about on a regular basis, you have them trying to exploit it on the other end now by saying, we're going to hold up this amateurism idea. We're going to laugh at the idea that you guys are paid employees, but then in the same token, that education that we always tout so highly, the education that we say is your reward for all this hard work, that quote-unquote free education, now we're going to sully that by creating the shadow classes that you heard about there. Lack of institutional control was one of the charges levied early on, but a class that was not only available to student-athletes, but that regular students had access to as well. So just making a mockery of the whole exercise on the institutional side of things.
Yeah, it makes the whole thing kind of a farce, right? I mean, and Roy Williams, by the way, it predated him. So not to say he isn't complicit at all, but he did arrive with those classes already taking place. Those, I think they called them paper classes or you said shadow classes?
Paper classes, shadow curriculum, paper classes, whatever you wanted to refer them to. But there was also the process of appeals where the NCAA levied their initial findings and then came back and excluded football and men's basketball in certain ways and closed the time frame to leave out some national championship seasons. So a lot of it got really convoluted by the end, and you're not really sure what to believe.
Come on, guys. Finger painting's a legitimate college class.
I would not be good at finger painting. I was never good at like arts and craftsy stuff. Actually, it's where my worst grades came in, handwriting and art. So I would probably get at least a C in finger painting.
First and Last, the podcast.
First and Last on the first birthday of First and Last, Robin Lundberg, Mike Golic Jr. here on ESPN Radio and the ESPN app. What an impressive horn or whatever that is there. I think we've had that conversation a million times, what you call that device or tool.
Sad party horn. It's sad party horn. It's my favorite tool, device, whatever you want to call it in radio, and it's all too appropriate because it is our very first birthday here, April 4th, 2016, a day that will live in infamy in the annals of ESPN radio history as we were born into existence. And a year later, we're somehow still on the air, which is exciting, and we're happy to be here.
North Carolina wins the championship over Gonzaga last night. Put these in order for me, Mike. They win 71-65. As far as the most talked about topics coming out of that game, Mark Few not being able to get it done as he's approaching the worst record ever against one seeds in the NCAA tournament, still yet to have a win against a one seed. Roy Williams' legacy, I read the stats earlier today about he has the best record in the NCAA tournament since he took over at North Carolina. And the quality of the game, the ugly style of the game and the refereeing, which was an abomination.
I don't know if you intentionally did this, but essentially reverse order in the way you mentioned it right there. The officiating is unfortunately going to be the story of that game just because it's so grossly affected in conjunction with some of the play itself, the overall watchability of the game, and then I go Roy Williams' legacy after that, and the Mark Few criticism that we're going to I want to say have to get over. The record that you stated there is hard to ignore. But again, using championships as the only metric to judge these coaches, to me, still seems like a really nonsensical idea, knowing full well the model of the tournament.
I'd love to not criticize the gameplay and the officiating. I have been critical of college basketball in the past quality-wise. But the tournament is something a lot of people like. I don't want to be the guy who is always, negative Nancy on stuff that a lot of people like. A lot of people watch this tournament, what have you. The second half, though, it just is what it is, was a chore to watch. I didn't think it in the first half. In the second half, I thought the game was decided in the first few minutes of the second half, by the way, where North Carolina's length and athleticism sort of took over and they made a run there. But foul after foul after foul, a whistle every 54 seconds on average in the game. There were 44 fouls called to just 46 field goals in the game. The shot percentages were low for both teams, but just a choppy flow. Basketball is a game of flow, and they didn't let it have any.
No, they didn't let it have any, and the result suffers, and I think some of it can be different. We mentioned how well-watched this tournament has been overall in some marquee games they've had. And the difference is, I'm like you. I want to ignore the officiating's place if at all possible, unless there's some egregious mistake. And that's easier in the games leading up to this, where until you get to the Final Four weekend, you've got a lot of games going on. You've got one after the other. But more importantly, they're not deciding a national championship that day. And so if you're doing something else while you're watching that game, if you're busy and have multiple screens open, that's fine. You get to a national championship, and all eyes are on you. This is the only show in town. It's the marquee event, and there's nothing after this. We finally get to decide who the champion is in this game, so it's going to be watched in a way that I don't know if you can match attention-wise aside from the Final Four games. And when you've got Final Four games that defied the pace of play that we expected in a couple of instances, it makes it all the more noticeable when you get what we got last night.
Yeah, and it can disrupt the way the players play. I mean, it can have a whole bunch of effects on the game because it was a close game. It wasn't a good game. But it was a close game, and these two teams were evenly matched. I've been repeating it. We started an hour early today. The differences, I think, were Gonzaga's a little bigger. They can shoot the ball a little bit better. But North Carolina has the athleticism and the length, which is a great equalizer in basketball especially. And you'd like to see it decided a little bit more between the lines, per se. We got some tweets coming in on the 1-800-Flowers Twitter feed about this. Pedror says NBA games are 48 minutes long, 6 fouls. College games are 40 minutes, 5 fouls, both 1 foul per 8 minutes. No need to change that in reference to what we were talking about earlier, how kids shouldn't foul out with 5 fouls. Well, you could go the Jeff Van Gundy route and say they shouldn't foul out in the pros either. I'm a proponent of basketball having the same rules, dimensions, and parameters across the board. I think FIBA, the NBA, and the NCAA should all play under the same rules. For college basketball, I would bring the three-point line out to the NBA style. That would open up the floor a little bit, create a little bit more driving, I think a little bit more spacing, less of that clunkiness that you get. I'd use the 24-second shot clock. I'd use the FIBA rules for goaltending. So I think there should just be basketball rules. It would also help kids adapt. There'd be no difference between Euro players coming over and having to adapt to the NBA three-point line or rules and college players having to adapt to basically a different sport in some ways.
And I've always lobbied for this when it comes to football and college football because there are a ton of differences between college football rules-wise and the NFL game. And I think what a lot of people would point to, and I'd be interested if this is something that once you set that standard, if it would just equal out over time, but a lot of people would point to the skill level and say that you may just not have kids that are capable of operating within some of those same set of rules at the same level, because we can talk about a lot of this for the game as far as the way it's officiated, extending it out, giving them other fouls, giving them other opportunities. You're just dealing with kids that are inherently aren't as good. And I think that's one thing I've certainly noticed about the NFL product more and more compared to the college product every day, which is that you've got guys that are just so much more hyper-skilled, dedicated to their craft, however you want to phrase it, that you may just never be able to fully get there, even with some of the rule changes, give these kids a chance to get out of their own way sometimes.
But they're playing in a smaller space, in a more confined space because of the college rules, which is going to lead to more contact, and it is going to lead to less opportunity for spacing to get things done. So I think it would work. I don't see why it wouldn't. These are all nitpicky stuff because, again, you mentioned it, the tournament has been highly rated. People have enjoyed it, so maybe we're making too big a deal of it. But it did seem to be the consensus last night. Like, this isn't me going, I'm NBA guy and college basketball is whack or whatnot. That second half felt objectively jarring to try and follow because there was no rhythm and because the officials wouldn't stop blowing the whistle like that old Too Short song.
Exactly, and I was out at a sports bar watching the game, and you knew it was getting to be too much. There was too much time spent at the line when I actually had time to have conversations with my friends. I came out to watch that game, to watch the action, and not have time to speak to people that eventually I ran out of things to say to. That was how many opportunities and chances we had to catch up to the point where all of a sudden I am fresh out of material and just praying that we can get a back-and-forth stretch that'll give us something else to look at and talk about and discuss that's not anything that has to do with me.
First and last.
Tons of calls made, Mike, but there was one that was missed, surprisingly.
Yeah, pretty big one before a late jump ball. Kennedy Meeks going down, trying to get involved for the ball, actually puts a hand out of bounds right as he's getting ready to make contact with the ball. Should have gone the other way, and instead the possession stayed with Carolina in another monumental swing at the end of a very close game.
Here was Mark Few.
From my angle, it didn't look like it was a situation where there was an out-of-bounds situation, or else I would have called for a review. So nobody made me aware of it, or I certainly would have within in the last minute there, or 2 minutes. So, that's tough to hear. But, that's just the way it goes.
Just like I would prefer not to rail against the quality of playing college basketball, I would also prefer not to rail against the referees. I understand things like that are going to happen. Mistakes, you're going to miss a call. Even if it's a big one, you're going to miss it. What I want to see is consistency with how the game is officiated. Not too many mistakes, obviously. And to err on the side of letting people play. Letting the players who were all there to watch play. That's my problem with NCAA officials. Not that they miss a call here and there, but that they call everything and that there's no uniform, it seems, reason or logic behind how they're making the calls. How it can be a foul on one side, and then it's not necessarily a foul on the other side for the same thing. It's just a cluster of whistles.
So this is twofold for me. One, you're right. I think it's the frequency and where the attention is focused in college basketball. And that's one thing I'm not really sure is how they deal with it for the collegiate hoop side of things. I know college compared to the NFL and football, in college you just go from crew to crew. You don't really have any specific understanding of the crew that's officiating you, and you certainly don't have an understanding of overall what the directives are for them, if there are any at all. And it's different because you've got conference officials for each conference that are working in conjunction from sometimes. But I think in general there needs to be more direction. In the NFL every year, I've always said, they send out videos, does the league office, saying this is what our competition committee has instructed the officials to look at more closely this year, to call more closely. And then you scout the crews. You have an understanding of their tendencies. More time is spent on that because you have more time to spend. I understand that doesn't exist in college, but I think that same pointed approach of collecting all of your officials and say, these are the things we want you to really focus on. We want to I'd say pare down some of the other scrutiny of certain situations. We really want to focus on these things to try and dial back the frequency of some calls. And then for blatant misses like this, we just need to bring back that snitch from the LPGA tournament. Just have that at-home snitch ready to send in emails when Kennedy Meek's hand goes out of bounds, and then he can alter the outcome of a championship-style game. We'll see how much everyone likes that.
Forget going to the control center or whatever, right? Like the league office to review the plays. Just let that be up to the fans to review a day later.
Let's go to Brian in his basement. Brian, you've got the call here for the championship game in college basketball.
Well, Brian in his basement might have done a better job than those refs last night. And here's the thing. You get people tweet in, right, angry stuff all the time. I don't know this guy. I don't recognize his Twitter handle. I mean, I've seen it before, but I don't know if he's like some sort of troll. But his picture, his avatar, is a basketball court, like a diagram. So I'd imagine he likes basketball. And Big D, the real D, tweets in, please stop talking about the game. It was one of the most boring games I've ever watched. And you're talking about the national championship game. Of course we're not going to stop talking about the national championship game. But that does seem to be, of all the things, you power ranked it earlier, the big takeaway that people were having is come on when watching that second half.
Yeah, just let them play is something we hear all the time, but never does it ring more true than last night. And I won't let the style of play skate, too, because I saw plenty of bad shots get taken in succession and in series of back and forth that ultimately were fruitless, that didn't contribute to the outcome of the game, but were certainly more palatable than seeing whistles blown as often as we heard them blown last night.
And you see some stunning statistics. I mean, North Carolina shot 14% from three, 14.8, so we'll round up to 15% from three, while Gonzaga shot 42% from three, and North Carolina still won the game. The difference there to me is the turnovers, 4 for North Carolina and 14 for Gonzaga. That's where that length of Carolina came into play. But neither team shot the ball very well, and a couple guys in particular, I think, really hurt Gonzaga. I mean, when Nigel Williams-Goss goes 5 of 17 from the floor, that's going to hurt. And Karnowski was just brutal last night. I thought on both ends, and really couldn't finish. A bunch of bunnies. I'd like to see the combined distance of his missed shots.
Yeah, and we talked about the bad shooting percentage, certainly, but you still had your stars come out to play in large part for North Carolina. Now, Kennedy Meeks was the star in the Final Four game, but Isaiah Hicks with 13 points. Justin Jackson, your All-American, went 0 for from the three-point line, 0 for 9 in a bad stretch, still had 16 points. And then Joel Berry, who ended up, I think, being the most outstanding. Was he the most outstanding player?
Yes.
I'd have to see. He was named the most outstanding player. 22 points for them last night. He was really like a pit bull. You saw him show up everywhere, whether it was on defense, driving in the lane, and making plays on offense. He was sensational. So there's something to be said to having your stars show up and play. And on the other side, outside of Nigel Williams-Goss, who had 15 points, Karnowski, Zach Collins, all those other guys held the single digits for scoring and just didn't come to play when they had been accustomed to for that team.
Here was Karnowski on all those missed bunnies.
I missed a lot of layups. I don't know. It was my best game. We threw the ball into the post and I didn't deliver, so I'll probably remember that. But at the same time, just playing with these guys for the last time, it's been an awesome year. And, this group of guys brought so much joy this year, basketball-wise and life-wise.
that Le Batard show game where they say this guy looks like he'd be a good candidate. Have they done Karnowski on that show?
I don't think they've done Karnowski yet. I don't know how much they get around to college players, but he'd be a great one. He's open to an infinite number of possibilities because being that large and having such a gifted beard really lends you to a lot of different likenesses.
Plus being 45 years old in college. I mean, does that make him more fair game?
Yeah, I think so. Anytime you got to check the birth certificate like that, and rightly so, when you've basically got a walking, living, breathing grizzly bear out there wrestling with another grizzly bear in Kennedy Meeks. I saw them both go to the ground going after a ball that was loose on the floor, and it looked like two grizzly bears fighting over a salmon.
That would be, I mean, that's a pretty good fight. Grizzly bears really like salmon. Grizzly bears are strong and powerful creatures. First and last, Robin Lundberg, Mike Golic Jr. here on ESPN Radio and the ESPN app. I didn't need to add to that. I don't know where I was going.
I would kill for the Anchorman bear fights drop right now because that was great analysis of the actual bear fight that we would have gotten instead of the pseudo bear fight that we got last night. That was really emblematic of the whole game overall. It was kind of slow, it was sloppy, and ultimately led to a play that should have been called. I think that play I'm referencing was the one where Kennedy Meeks' hand went out of bounds. So really a lot of different elements of that game wrapped up into one beautiful, awkward moment.
If you're running away from a bear, what do?
Run downhill.
Yeah.
Grizzly bear can run up to 30 miles an hour. You want to get that momentum going downhill, see if he can trip up a little bit.
Well, they got those strong hind legs. It's difficult for them to stop their momentum with the front legs. So if you're out of the play dead option or you're not quite to the play dead option, you run down a hill if you can find it.
Exactly. I would describe a grizzly bear running style as ambling, and that works for either of the players we've described in this conversation as well. But anytime you've got someone ambling down a hill, you usually set yourself up for quite a tumble. I've been a part of one or two of those in my lifetime as well. Inertia is a powerful, powerful force, Robin, and in this case, it might just save your life.
Mina Kimes tweeted, Karnowski looks like the guy James Bond has to fight before the main villain. That's pretty good.
That one is pretty good. I saw she had another one about Zach Collins from Gonzaga saying it's funny to imagine him as Jared from Silicon Valley playing in a basketball game. She was on fire last night, much in the way that neither of these teams really were from the field.
First and last.
Brutal watch for the most part in the second half of that game, unfortunately, because you never want that to be the takeaway from a game like that. Because normally you would be talking about, legacies and the like. And one legacy that is going to come up is Roy Williams. And at this point, Mike, I would say his legacy is beyond reproach. I can simply pull up a packet of information that we're sent and read you a couple of sentences from it, and you have no counter-argument. He became the sixth coach to win at least 3 national titles. That puts him right below Adolph Rupp, Mike Krzyzewski, and John Wooden. Since he took over at North Carolina, they've been the best team in the country in the NCAA tournament. And since he took over at North Carolina 2003-2004, here's where they rank in the following categories: NCAA tournament wins, Final Fours, national titles. 1, 1, and 1. So what are you going to say?
It seems incontrovertible, and the nature of the NCAA tournament gets brought up more and more now because we realize what a poor model for picking a true champion, someone who's representative of who may have been the best team in college basketball all season long. Like a lot of postseason tournaments, it can allow just a team to get hot and healthy at the right time and go from there. And so while I don't think using championships as a sole metric works because of that, you can still point to the fact that he's been able to do this over a long time period, consistently get to this point now 3 times with 3 different teams. That speaks volumes to that. 8 regular season championships in the ACC, which we always laud as one of the toughest conferences in basketball, always sends a bunch of teams to the tournament, and usually ones with deep runs. I think that stuff can be taken into account just as much as anything else. This is a conversation we had around Bill Self this weekend as he was voted into the 2017 Basketball Hall of Fame class, a guy with 13 straight Big 12 championships who's displayed that consistent excellence, who has took a lot of heat for getting bounced in the Elite Eight this year and sometimes underperforming with very talent-laden teams. A lot of that could be said with Roy Williams, but he's got similar regular season success and the elongated postseason success to back it up as well.
Now, there's another famous coach at North Carolina by the name of Dean Smith, and here's what Roy Williams said about being compared.
Dana O'Neill at the ESPN. Roy, I know they're all sweet, but because of how last year's ended, does this one feel any differently?
You know, Dana, I think it does. They're all, as you said, they're all really sweet. I mean, every 351 teams start thinking that maybe we could do that. Some of them more realistic than others, but even the ones that have no chance, they think of that moment. So they're all extremely special. I've been very, very lucky, but I'd say this one is probably more special because it's been a journey for the last 3 or 4 years of trying to do something. The tough thing is it doesn't make Marcus, Bryce, and Joel feel any better. So that's the thing that I'm going to have for a long time.
Well, the way the audio was labeled is different than what Roy Williams actually had to say. He didn't say anything about Dean Smith, though he doesn't think he belongs in the same conversation as Dean Smith. We'll find that a little bit later. What he was talking about is getting retribution for the loss last year in that particular cut.
That was the one thing I sat in awe of at the end of the game last night as I was waiting for what felt like the Grand Canyon-sized gap between the end of the game and finally getting the payoff of one shining moment that we wait for every single year, was that this was a team that lost on the biggest stage in one of the most dramatic ways we've ever seen last year and was actually able to, with a team that returned a lot of those same players, channel all of that aggression, channel all of that regret and anger, whatever the feelings that there were for them coming off that game, and actually make it meaningful. I think there's 4 teams that in the history of this tournament that have lost the title and then returned the very next year the way North Carolina did. And you're just so overwhelmed because you go into every offseason and you've got the shirts made up with your motto and you talk about your motivations for the year, and they've got the ultimate motivation of having the trophy right within their grasp, having those rings fitted for their fingers, and then having it snatched away. And they were actually able to translate that in a meaningful way every day, despite not being ranked the number 1 team during the season for long stretches, despite a number of things that they had to overcome with the tournament style, and still found a way back here and said, we weren't going to let it happen again.
Well, look, you have to have the talent to get it done. You have to have the coaching, the skill, and all that. But that's a darn good motivator. It's sort of reminiscent of the Spurs. Remember, in Game 6, had the trophy down on the court, and they wound up losing famously. Ray Allen tied it with the shot, and they went to overtime. And then the Heat won Game 7. And then the next year, the Spurs blew their doors off in the NBA Finals. So having that taste, right? And people talk about getting that taste. You want a little bit more of it.
There's no greater intoxicant known to man. As I firmly believe that, because once you've seen it and once it becomes real for you in that way, there's no erasing that vision. There's no erasing the vision that I had of a national championship ring that I got to see prior to our game, that I got to see a mock-up of. You see that, you understand you're the last show in town, you know all these things, and when it's ripped away from you, it's a hurt that most people who talk about losing in those moments, myself included, will not forget for the rest of their lives. And so when you've got the chance to right that ship, when you've got the chance to channel all that energy into something meaningful, and you actually take it, what greater satisfaction can there be?
Well, the comparisons to Dean Smith that we mentioned before, I do believe we have Roy Williams on that topic now that he has won a 3rd national championship. Oh, we don't have it. All right. That's the elusive. I'm going to just move on from that one. It looked like it was highlighted on my screen there.
And you know what you can say is we've talked about great PR moves all tournament. That's always great PR if you are Roy Williams, is to make sure that you always say, well, I can never compare myself to insert name of all-time great at my program here, because it always makes you look humble and endearing to the fans.
Let's answer the question for Roy Williams. Since we don't have it, I'll ask it to you and you can ask it to me. So, Roy, now that you have won another national championship with North Carolina, have the best record in the NCAA tournament since you took over, since 2003, 2004, is it fair to say that you've entered the conversation with the great Dean Smith?
Hell yeah, it is. I'm the best there is, plain and simple. How's that, dadgummit?
That's pro wrestler Roy Williams. I would think Roy Williams actually answered it more like, well, there's been a lot of great coaches over the years, and dadgummit, Dean Smith is right there near the top, and I'm humbled to even be mentioned in the same breath as my contemporaries. I wouldn't want to put myself with a legend like the great Dean Smith. We'll find out what he actually said. We have it. We have the cut. You heard a little teaser there. You heard it. You'll hear what Roy Williams had to say when compared to Dean Smith. Finally, coming up next. First and last, Robin Lundberg, Mike Golic Jr. here on ESPN Radio and the ESPN app.
First and last, the podcast.
Are you finally ready, Mike?
Robin, I've never been more ready for anything.
North Carolina ready to avenge their loss last year. Not against the same team, of course, but they did beat Gonzaga 71-65. And we've been waiting to hear from Roy Williams on possible comparisons between himself and Dean Smith. Finally, it is here.
I don't think Roy Williams should ever be put in the same sentence with Dean Smith. I really don't. I think Coach was the best there's ever been on the court, and he was an even better person. And so it's a little staggering. When I look up at one of the boards tonight and it saw those guys, they had more titles than our North Carolina teams had it, not Roy Williams, because I don't like it that way. But that was a little emotional for a second. But I really, I don't know what to say. I mean, because I'm very, very lucky. I'm doing what I've always wanted to do, is to coach kids and trying to get them to have a common goal and make sacrifices. And it's number 3, but they've all been fantastic, and I've been very fortunate.
If we're going to be technical about it, I don't think Roy Williams and Dean Smith belong in the same sentence, is putting Roy Williams and Dean Smith in the same sentence.
Dang. That's woke, Robin.
Yeah.
That really is a very underhanded way of doing so by Roy Williams. I will say I agree with that. We've now got them in the same sentence. We need to figure out whose name comes first in that sentence is even the bigger question coming up. But I also want to ask producer guy Dan Z, because he was very critical of Frank Martin and his press conference tears. I heard Roy Williams get a little emotional in that presser right there. Dan, real or fake tears from Roy Williams?
First of all, he did what any real man did. He choked it back like a man.
Oh.
No, men are allowed to cry. Sorry. I have to call foul there, like the refs last night.
We got producer guy Man Z over here.
Yeah. Crying is it's good. It doesn't mean you're weak.
Crying should be done in the privacy of your own bedroom with the door shut, maybe some candles lit, and some soft music. Everybody knows that.
That's a really interesting setting for it. What I will say is in all seriousness, about some crying as it pertains to last night, because you saw a lot of the kids getting emotional coming off the floor.
Sure.
Nigel Williams-Goss, particularly because of the late game sequence there, his rolled ankle affecting his ability to get up for one of those shots. And all these kids, they're devastated. The one thing I always say, man, wait till you get to the locker room for that one, because you don't want to end up on One Shining Moment in the tear montage covered in loser confetti. It's not fun. It's not pretty, and you get remembered on that for a long, long time when you let it happen. I'm fine with it. That's the one where I'll say I might agree with Dan Z. The setting there, you just don't want to be the guy caught slipping on camera.
Well, you don't want to be Adam Morrison, even more so, right? That's got to be the most famous negative tears that we've seen. Adam Morrison sporting the new look last night, though. He looked like a lifeguard from a summer movie or something last night.
He looked like a new man. I don't know what he's doing, but keep doing that and just completely forget about what you did before in that prior life.
First and last, Robin Lundberg, Mike Golic Jr. here on ESPN Radio and the ESPN app as we get you set for Mike and Mike. Of course, talking about the national championship game. UNC beating Gonzaga 71-65. More on Roy Williams, more on the quality of the game, which is not receiving stellar reviews. What would you say the Rotten Tomatoes score would be if that game was reviewed?
Oh, God, that's going to be about a 40% from last night. And that's me even being generous just because the game was competitive. It had a close score, a lot of back and forths.
I'll go about the combined field goal percentage. I'll say it was like a 34, 35%, and would be deemed rotten on Rotten Tomatoes. But there is other news in college basketball that's worth discussing, and that's Georgetown hiring Patrick Ewing. Patrick Ewing has been looking for a head coaching job for a long, long time. You can't say he didn't earn it in that regard. It's not just because he has the name. Now, where he's going is what's interesting about it, because I don't know if there's a middle ground in this sort of scenario with Patrick Ewing going to Georgetown. Either he's the hero who returns and turns the program back to its glory years, or it's like a miserable failure. I don't know if there's moderate success involved.
No, there isn't, and it always gets interesting in college because colleges, especially the blue bloods, big-time programs, love bringing in their own guys. But you've got the heightened version of this. Patrick Ewing joins Chris Mullen of St. John's as the only D1 head coaches who were Hall of Famers as players. Both schools happen to be in the Big East, so it's a tall task, and it's taller for no one than Patrick Ewing, who actually cares about this school as much as anyone else. When you are an alumni, when you did play for that school, it completely changes the equation and what you expect and hope for yourself in that. You want to be the savior more than anyone else wants you to be the savior. You want to return them to prominence and do right by a place that did right for you. And I think that's exactly what stands in front of Patrick Ewing now.
Yeah, I mean, we've seen some of these have the storybook endings, most notably LeBron recently going back to Cleveland and all that. So there's that potential, I mean, for it to be sort of immortalized forever. And hopefully Patrick Ewing gets it done. I don't know how the guy's going to be as a coach. I know he's spent a lot of time as an assistant on various benches, most recently with the Charlotte Hornets.
Yeah, and I think that's an important part. You talked about him earning this, and a lot of that's come up whether it's been certain hires. Magic Johnson was the most notable one recently, but players, and whether it is Jason Kidd, Steve Kerr, guys getting hired, going straight from being players to being coaches, where a lot of people, or front office, as Magic put it there, John Lynch in the NFL, the credentials have come up and become a point of contention. Guys having not, quote-unquote, earned it the way most people are accustomed to coming up in that profession. You can't dispute that with Patrick Ewing. He's been an assistant with 4 different teams since 2002, has gotten a lot of that experience, and now gets to try it firsthand. Listen, you never know how someone's going to be as a head coach until they are, and we understand his affinity, his role, and what he did for this school played a part in this job, but he's also a guy that's got the resume to back it up, has been around coaching now for a long time, and isn't just jumping into this without really looking before he leaps.
It's been a long time since Georgetown was a prominent program. I mean, they've put a couple of guys into the NBA who've had some success in recent years. Otto Porter has been pretty good for the Washington Wizards, especially since he became a three-point shooter. But you're talking about Allen Iverson on the latter end of that. But Patrick Ewing, for those who don't remember or realize, he was a huge college star and one of the biggest prospects to ever come into the NBA draft, to the point of conspiracy theories on the Knicks getting the first pick in the draft and the frozen envelope and everything like that. So Georgetown was a big deal. And you look at some of the programs that were a big deal and where they rank. After last night, North Carolina is smack dab in the middle of the top 5 of most national championships ever. And it's kind of a sandwich because you have on the bottom Indiana, who just hired a new coach. To me, Indiana just doesn't register that much because it's been really a long time. The last championship for them was 1987, even though they've won 5. Historically a prominent program, but at this moment, something like Gonzaga may have passed them, right? Duke is tied with them at 5. Carolina and Kentucky. Carolina has 6, and Kentucky has 8. To me, the top 3 programs currently going are those 3. Kentucky, North Carolina, and Duke. And at the top is UCLA, which is still good and has a chance to get back to the glory, especially if they can live up to any of the hype that LeVar Ball has given them. But it's still been since 1995 since UCLA has won the title, and we know they won a bunch of those in succession.
Yeah, it becomes really difficult, and you wonder where that line is because you mentioned Gonzaga. Some of these upstart programs that we've seen have a lot more success, especially making a name for himself when it comes tournament time, if they're mid-majors or just playing a weaker conference the way Gonzaga does. When does that line happen to where we really start to weight that brand name of that school the way we do some of these blue bloods? Because you mentioned Indiana hasn't really been relevant in quite some time, or at least it hasn't felt that way in some time. When do you start to let the embers of yesteryear die off to the new flame of a school coming up? And it's always a difficult prospect because you have all these memories, these generational ties, and it really feels like it's going to take that other generation being one more removed before you get any sort of seismic changes in the landscape like that.
I don't think North Carolina is going anywhere as they pick up that national championship again last night. A bit of a pro factory at that place, much like Kentucky has been, and they get the win last night, in large part due to some of the talent on that roster. To me, the biggest difference, Mike, in that game was the start of the second half. the length and athleticism of North Carolina affecting Gonzaga very clearly. Gonzaga turns the ball over a few times. North Carolina gains control on the scoreboard, and they never relinquished it. And that's when the momentum started to be broken up, not just for the Zags, but in the play of the game, which unfortunately, for what has been a successful tournament, probably by any measure, is going to be the final, the one shining moment is not going to be a good one in the narrative or the talk today.
No, that's going to be the overwhelming portion of this conversation, but you're right. What shouldn't get lost in all of that, despite some of the poor shot selection and poor play at times offensively, is that defensive effort that North Carolina put on against a Gonzaga team that came into this game much more known throughout the tournament. I think they were number one ranked in a lot of categories for their defense, and instead it's North Carolina who was able to bother and make them uncomfortable in the areas that they had excelled in the most, particularly in that painted area with Zach Collins, with Karnowski, and these guys that had made a living beating up on other teams in the paint and weren't able to last night.
To me, the hardest thing to adjust to in basketball is length, because some of those passes, those shots you're used to being able to get off, they're taken away. And you saw that at the beginning of the second half as North Carolina takes away another national championship.
Thank you for listening to the First and Last podcast. You can listen and subscribe to all ESPN podcasts in the Listen tab of the ESPN app. First and Last.